morning and a hearty welcome to this first talk or session. And we have Professor Janice or John T. Ossoliins. He comes from the Catholic University, Melbourne campus, Australia. To speak about Dr. John, he is a professor of philosophy at Australian Catholic University, honorary fellow at Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, University of Latvia. He is also a foreign member of the Latvian Academy of Sciences, also a visiting professor or fellow at a number of institutions, including Oxford. He is a fellow of Higher Education Research and Development Society of Australia and a fellow and former president of the Philosophy of Education Society of Australia. He is Secretary General of the World Union of Catholic Philosophical Societies and Vice President of Asia Oceania of Conference Model Institutions, Universities, Catholics, their philosophy. His philosophical interests range broadly over the metaphysics and moral philosophy of Aquinas, applied ethics, and philosophy of education. Dr. Janice, we are very happy to have you, privileged to have you, and to this Desmond and Dimana International Memorial Lectures, and I call on to deliver. We have 25 minutes, and then 20 minutes of introduction.
I've got a timer here, so I'll set it going right now. It's going I don't intend to read my paper at all, it's quite long. So what hopefully I will do is go through the paper using you'll notice I have to make this disclaimer to start with. I have appropriated certain Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander images. They were free on the web, but I'd like to acknowledge that I'm using these images without the permission from the traditional owners of them. So hopefully, since none of them are here, hopefully they'll forgive me for that. Okay, just very quickly, what I want to cover. Well, introduction. I think it's probably the most important part. I will probably concentrate rather more on the initial part of this paper rather than the elaboration of some of the values and some of the guidelines associated with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. Broadly speaking, there is a real problem in Australia. Our opening speaker talked about text, interpretation, meaning, and significance. But all of that is largely concentrated on text. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and tradition is an oral culture and tradition, very much so. And as I'll go on to say, that creates a lot of problems in the interface between Western research, Western culture, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. So there is a tension here, and it's a tension that hasn't been resolved. For all the guidelines, for all of the good will, there is still a major difficulty in being able to, for Westerns in particular, and I would guess other cultures, to understand the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. So I want to set that into a real context, because this is the real problematic here in terms of the hermeneutics. There just isn't one. Okay, I'll say something about negotiated consent, because what I wanted to really get into, this is quite a practical kind of issue. So it isn't what I'm not concentrating here on theory so much as laying out what are some of the issues, what are the kinds of things that the guidelines try to address, probably unsuccessfully, I would have to say. There are two sets of guidelines, which is also interesting. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to go through them in much detail. The first one, the IATSE guidelines, are ones that are preferred by most of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples themselves. The Values and Ethics document is a document that's put out by the government, by the Commonwealth Government. Also in consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but there are tensions between these two groups. So there is a great number of difficulties in negotiating, being able to do research within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Okay. European settlement of Australia dates back basically to 1788. So there's a picture of the first fleet, the British landing on the east coast of Australia. Of course, we know that various other Dutch and Portuguese, Spanish explorers did reach the west coast of Australia, mostly by accident. If you have any idea of the geography of the southern part of the world, there are these brilliant winds called the Roaring Forties, which race along the bottom of the southern hemisphere and are wonderful. If you come down the east coast of Africa, or if you're coming from Europe, head right down south to get to what was known as the East Indies, which is now Indonesia. You go right down to the bottom, scoot across the bottom with these Roaring Forties, then head up towards Indonesia. Of course, navigation being what it is, occasionally they went a little bit too far and came in contact with the west coast of Australia. So 16th century, some claim late 16th century, there are apparently some remains of boats that actually accidentally hit the west coast. So, but in effect, European settlement only began in 1788 on the east coast, but in fact the Aboriginal occupation of Australia is estimated to be around about 40,000 years, give or take. Think about the origins of the human race, allegedly from Africa around about 65, 70,000 years ago. The migration from Africa to other nations occurring sometime after that. Some estimate the Aboriginal peoples could have reached Australia maybe even 60,000 years ago. So it's a long occupation, a long time in the country. It was never terra nullius. Now that's significant because in Australia, in Australian law, originally when it was claimed by the British, it was claimed that, well, it wasn't really occupied. But in fact, it's now recognised that that was not the case. It was not, and never was, terra nullius. There were many Aboriginal peoples. It's estimated the population of Aboriginals within Australia probably was over 1 million at the time of European settlement. And there were many nations. It was not, they were a hunter-gatherer culture, civilization, but it's now recognised that in fact they used technology. Primitive technology, one might think, but in many ways very sophisticated. They had a very sophisticated way of managing Australia. When the European settlers first came to Australia, they were amazed at the park-like way in which the countryside seemed to be, that they viewed it. This was done by the Aboriginals. They did it by controlled burning of the land. We don't do that so much now, and we have terrible bushfires in Australia. So we've gone in a different way. We don't manage the land as well. And there were reasons why they did that. One of the reasons why they did control burning was, of course, because it would ensure that land was cleared. You had then new growth, grasses and so on, which attracted game, kangaroos and other game, which would then be hunted. So it was a kind of, although they did not actually husband, if you like, and raise flocks or I don't know whether you call them flocks of Aboriginal, flocks of Aboriginal, but they did not husband them in the way in which we, in the West, might have, a flock of sheep and so on. But they did plan and use the land in such a way that they attracted animals to pastures and so on, so that they had a food supply. So it's quite sophisticated. Other parts of the country show very sophisticated ways of managing waterways and so on. So it certainly wasn't a terra nullius. It certainly, there was a civilization. Okay, now, what are Indigenous people? Indigenous people, according to the one definition, are the people who are part of a land prior to being conquered by colonial powers or societies, and who consider themselves distinct from those societies, from the governing societies, or those governing those territories. So they're called Indigenous peoples. There are roughly, according to UN figures, roughly 300 to 500 million Indigenous peoples around the world. So there are substantial numbers of Indigenous peoples. I won't go into terribly much about that. The problems, of course, that Indigenous people face are very similar in many countries. And the reasons for that is that clearly, if they are labelled as Indigenous peoples, they are somehow separate from that colonial government or the colonial occupying power, if you like. In fact, some Aboriginals still think of white Australia as being a kind of colonial occupying power. Generally speaking, they're reasonably tolerant of all of us whites that have come to their country. Okay, so what are the problems that they face? And I think it's important to get a sense of the background, because it also gives us an idea of the immense pain and anger that some of them feel in the way in which that Western researchers in particular go into their communities seeking to do various things there, find things out, and then disappearing again. They get very angry about that. Okay, why? They're overrepresented in Australian jails. There are more Aboriginal peoples in Australian jails than the general population. They have low levels of literacy. They don't do very well at school, in traditional schools. Many leave well before the finish of high school. Quite a high percentage of them only manage to get to about year 9. I'm not quite sure what the Indian equivalents here are, but we have 12 years of schooling in Australia. They mostly don't finish. They might leave well before the majority of white Australians. White Australian currently to year 12, we're looking at around about 85 to 90% of children finish schooling. Aboriginal peoples, we're probably looking at less than 50% would even get anywhere near that. There's high unemployment, much higher than in the usual Australian population. They have low life expectancy. And this is perhaps a bit surprising. The health issues are substantial. The average Australian Life expectancy is about 80 years, 81 point something average. For women it's 83 or something, and for men it's 79 or something. So roughly 81 is the life expectancy. For Aboriginals, it's about 56. That's a substantial difference. So low life expectancy. Clearly, there are other issues. Their traditional lands and sacred sites are exploited. As you probably all know, Australia is the great mining mecca of the world. If you want a mineral, we've got it in Australia. Come and dig it up. We've got iron ore mountain ranges, literally, of iron ore. So over in the west, in the Pilbara, they're just digging away all the mountains. Coal, we have 40% of the world's gas reserves or something like that. We have nearly all of the world's uranium, so anybody interested in buying nuclear? We have plenty, so plenty to spare. We have nearly all the world's uranium, 80%. So, but the problem is these are generally near traditional lands and sacred sites. I don't know how things work in India, but you try stopping a mining company from exploiting land. It's almost like they've got this tunnel vision. They can see the dollars and away they go. Doesn't matter what gets in the way, they'll exploit it. Culture is exploited, truly wise. You'll see sacred images, for example, on tea towels. If you were a Muslim, for example, and you printed a portrait, I know Muslims would not do this, but it's the same kind of thing. If, say, for example, you printed an image of the Prophet on a tea towel to dry your dishes, that is commonplace when it's to do with Aboriginal sacred images and so on. So the culture is exploited, to be honest. Fortunately, it's not a great deal of help in some ways, but at least the UN recognises some of these problems. Indigenous people have a right to their cultural traditions and customs, and they have a right to have their cultural property returned to them. That's Article 12. They're also entitled to recognition of ownership, control and protection of their cultural and intellectual property. They have a right to special measures to develop and protect their sciences, technologies and cultural manifestations and so on. The last one's actually very important because the Aboriginal peoples, and I refer to them as the Aboriginal, it's a bit like, and here, Aboriginal peoples don't really like to be referred to kind of as a bulk. It's a bit like saying, Europeans like X, Y, and Z. They prefer you to refer to particular peoples, Murray, the Koori, and so on. A bit like saying that all Europeans are exactly the same. Well, they're not quite. But for the sake of ease, I'm referring to them as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it honours, at least to a certain extent, that they're not just a lump of a homogeneous mass, they're not. All right, these are actually very important because there are certain kinds of technologies and certain things that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have developed in relation to knowing about the land that is open to exploitation by the West, and they have a right to keeping that knowledge. Okay. A little bit about the context in which we can understand Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. It's important to understand that they have a very different notion of the self. It's not to say that there aren't individuals. We can go a little bit too far in that direction, saying, well, there is no individual self in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. In general, that's not true either. What is true, though, is that they have to be understood within the context of community and in the notion of belonging. They belong to a particular place and to a particular community. Now, what does that mean? Basically, what that suggests is that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and peoples have a very intimate relationship between themselves and the land in which they have lived over many thousands of years. And they also relate to particular communities. There are nations, different nations within. They estimate there is roughly something like, at the time of colonisation, there was something like 300 different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. 300. Now, that isn't to say that some of them weren't interrelated and they couldn't understand each other, but there were 300 languages. So it was a very diverse culture. And it was a very diverse culture because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander societies lived in particular places that were theirs. Well, not theirs in the sense of belonging, but it belonged to them, but in the sense that they belonged to that place. And they lived in kinship groups, tribal groups, smaller groups. And they were organised obviously in a slightly broader sense than that. So the other thing that's important is the notion that all beings are connected. So this is a very important understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sense of who they are. Everything is connected. You're connected to the land. You're connected to the flora. You're connected to the animals, the insects, the birds, the other animals that exist in that place. And I think this is a really important point. And they're things that are specific to particular places. Not only that, everything is integrated. It isn't just an integration with physical people. You exist in a connection between the physical and the spiritual. Everything is connected together. The whole world is connected together. So the ancestors are still there. They're there in a different way. They're in a spiritual way. So when the West talks about the dreaming, this is a metaphor that's actually misleading. It isn't a dream. All of these things, the past and the present, exist at once. They're all there. You're part of a living culture. They're all integrated. One affects the other. If I have evil thoughts about someone, these are manifested in a physical way in the world in some sort of sense. It may be that I think evil thoughts about someone and they fall over and break a leg. Well, there's a physical manifestation. Now, they would see that as a connection, that my evil thoughts caused this, and the person to who broke the leg, or someone has done this to me. Someone has been thinking evil thoughts about me, and somehow these things are all connected. So these things are all connected. I've got to keep an eye on the time. I think I've gone too slow. I am a little out of time. It's 20 minutes. Okay, I better go a bit quicker. All right, so the notions of the self in the West, we can understand also this in a historical context. There's a narrative that's for the Aboriginal people woven from the stories of the elders. So the being in a particular place and in the community will act to form that individual's identities. Narratives, experiences and stories are not about the past, but they all exist in the present, shaping the future, the person. So even urban dwellers, so even those who don't live anywhere near their tribal place, will still identify with that tribal place and with that community. So if you meet an Aboriginal person, they might describe themselves, I'm a Noongar woman or man from back of Taree or somewhere. They will describe it in a very particular way, even though they've never lived in that place. Well, the most important point there is to recognise the importance of that connection. I mean, we recognise that ourselves within our own Western cultures, that we need to have a sense of solidarity with others, we need to have a sense of belonging, that being torn from our communities creates terrible, terrible strains on us. We do need to have connections with our communities. It's mostly, and this is why it's so important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, even more so than for those of us in the West. Okay, central to research with Indigenous peoples is informed or negotiated consent. It could mean consent of a group. Now I'll skip over that a little bit. This is important because knowledge doesn't belong to any individual. So you can't go to an individual Aboriginal person and say, tell us about the fauna, tell us about the medical stuff that you're doing. I want to know about this. It doesn't belong to that person. It belongs to the group. It belongs to, it's a sharing of all of that knowledge. And the sharing of that knowledge is verbal. They learn the stories. It's an oral culture. It's not written down. It's never written down. Because to write it down is to make it static. And for someone to have access to that means they appropriate what's not theirs. They steal it. It's a violation of the sacred. So it's very important here that knowledge belongs to a particular kinship group. It belongs to that particular community. It's nobody's in particular, and it must never be written down. Okay, it's held in custody because that shared knowledge is what identifies them as who they are. All right, some of these guidelines, which I'm not going to go through because I'm running out of time completely, and I knew this would happen, which is why I've only just, I'll give you that statement and then I'll skip through very quickly what the guidelines look like, but I don't intend to actually address them. I think it's much more important to get a sense of what the hermeneutic is within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The important point to note, if you want to do research with that community, you have to go into that community. You can't simply just, like some of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples themselves complain, researchers fly in, try and do whatever their anthropological research or whatever it is they're wanting to do, and then fly out again because they've got what they want out of the people. They've put nothing back to the community. They have not engaged with the community in any kind of way. 5 minutes, thank you. All right. The other thing is they want to be invited in to be researchers themselves. Now that creates something of a problem if you think about that. The researcher, here am I, spent years at university, got my doctorate, I'm the expert. Who are these Indigenous people? Haven't even finished year 9, for God's sake. How can they tell me and be researchers with me? Big problem. So, for the Indigenous people, there's no distinction. They are part of that, part of the research too, and you have to understand them as being equal partners. All right, so some of the guidelines, and I'll just skip through these fairly quickly. They're there. I won't read them all out, but it's important to recognise that these deal with the idea that we have to respect Indigenous people and understand and come to understand just their way of about the world, which is very different from certainly a Western perspective and from other kinds of cultural perspectives. That some of these traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions may never be actually expressed or allowed to be seen by any other culture. So there are things which are so sacred that you do not allow anyone to see. So there are secret men's business, secret women's business, and no one is to see what happens in those rituals, in those particular ways of expressing culture. Okay, so here, if you're going to want to do that, do some research, you have to respect those cultural traditions and go no further than that community will allow you to go. So there is the responsibility for consultation throughout. There is never a time when you say, here, sign this, and that's the negotiation, and that's it. There may well be a formal agreement, but this consent has to be constantly renegotiated. Okay, so the last four there, they have to be involved in the research in different kinds of ways, and there are obviously certain kinds of things that we expect in the ethics kind of framework. All right, now the last little bit, the values and ethics document. This is interesting because what it does do is at least set out the 6 important values of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. As you can see why they were developed. And here are the 6 values. 6 basic values: spirit and integrity, reciprocity, respect, equality, survival and protection, and responsibility. Now, I don't have time to elaborate these, but I think the most important of these, spirit and integrity, interweaves all of these. The understanding of what is the spirit of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, and are we in attempting to work with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community faithful to an integration of all of these particular values. Most important one there, well, they're all important, but one that I think I'd single out a little bit is reciprocity. Now, reciprocity means that you don't go into a community, as I said, you know, that example of fly in and fly out, and I don't care about the community. The community expects that the research, if you're coming into the research, what does it mean for that community? Are you going to give something back? What are you giving back to the community? Now, this could be a number of things. You know, if you're doing healthcare research, perhaps you could provide some assistance in treating various illnesses, do some nursing, or something like that. Help with hygiene. Practical things which can go back into the community. So reciprocity is a very key element in understanding how you relate to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Right, just to finish, respect for persons is vital because we need to understand and try very hard to understand the community. It's a partnership for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It's not just something that researchers do. You need to listen very carefully to the communities in which you go. Thank you. I think I'm going to be over.
Thank you, Professor Pauselins, for very, very clearly explaining to us the interface between colonizers and indigenous people. He brought to us very discreetly the differences between these two in their education or in their life expectancy. But one of the things that was very well explained, the world of indigenous people and its nuances. The oral tradition, which is very flexible, fluid and flowing, it cannot be static or cannot be objectified. I think when you do a research, it gets objectified, and I don't know how to reconcile that. So we leave the open for questions. We have maybe 10 minutes for questions. Anyone can raise their hand for any intervention. Yes.
Yeah, this is fascinating.